Lavité, La Bâtarde, and L'Opoponax as Bildungsroman, as coming-of-age novels. Indeed, my own coming-of-age. It is thanks to them and to other novels, films, television show, or exhibitions that I discovered at a rather young age a treasure trove of signs and clues in which I felt a kind of connection. So, to go back to my title, whether they conveyed negative or positive images was absolutely not at all important. Fantasies don't discriminate. That's my title. The pleasure of reading transformed these novels into text of pleasure, and this is what I'm going to talk about my own fantasies of rereading the three novels, the three books, L'Invité, La Bâtarde, and L'Opoponax. Three works that probably brought into play, for me, experiences of homosexuality. But in rereading them, I was reminded that they're neither one or homogeneous in the experience of homosexuality. Indeed, rereading at a rather older moment of my life enhanced the complexities of discourse in these novels. The writing of a non-heterocentric self. D'accord, pardon. Oh, I have to take it. Give me the mic, I'm going to do that.
So this is a very long
Okay. But I can't read. Okay. The writing of the non-heterocentric real self rearticulates the supposedly centered position of the I in La Bâtarde, of the she in L'Invité, and of the on in L'Opoponax. The on, which has been translated as a you, can also be translated as a one, but doesn't convey the whole idea of the on in L'Opoponax. It also convokes peripheric scenes of homosexuality, all these composing a kaleidoscope. So let me shake this kaleidoscope a little bit for you. And first, I should mention the technical setup I'm using. What I've decided to do is to put on the screen the quotes in French from the three novels I'd like you to read. And in order to divert you from reading, I shall speak English. Okay. First, L'Invité. She came to stay in English. There are several ways to read Lesbian Desire in L'Invité, a novel that the biographer Tori Moy describes as an existentialist melodrama. Trio equals melodrama. As, sorry, my PowerPoint doesn't work. Okay. Technical problem?
I'll try.
Okay. Trio equals melodrama, as films such as Les Biches has repeatedly taught us. And also in Hollywood films such as Serenade, which is based on a much gayer screenplay and its film version, written by James Cain, and which seriously fed my fire. L'Invité is a classic novel written in the third person of Françoise, who obviously is a narrative voice. It takes place in Paris, also an important character in the novel, with its cafes and ballrooms and the hotel where one lives. It is a bourgeois world, a world of bourgeois cultural practices. It is mentioned that theater is important in the novel, easel painting is referred to, dance is referred to. It takes place in 1938, and the novel is published in 1943. The context for the plot is the autumn following the Munich Agreement, and it extends to the mobilization of the French army. We know this because there's a man mixed up in this, and therefore a future soldier. Françoise has one man in her life with Labrousse, by his last name. The two of them are one, repeatedly says Françoise. Pierre Labrousse is an actor and a playwright-director. For Françoise, things are less clear. We don't know exactly what she does. As the novel begins, Xavier, the girl, has come into Françoise's life, and the book ends with Françoise opening the gas valve, most probably to kill Xavier. Exactly like in Le Biche, it's a sort of reverse position. Tori Moy again mentions that this ending as an aesthetic, going back to aesthetic, disaster, where an action from outside daily life, murder, functioned as a motive force and raison d'être behind the entire novel, I'm quoting her. Opening the gas is a desperate act, which, however, as Tori Moy writes, frees Françoise from her unhealthy dependence on Pierre. But not only we can immediately add, because it is also a way to put an end to a non-realized desire between Françoise and Xavier, and to anchor another desire out of I, which is to put a whole novel in the works, or in other words, to cause the narration to pass into the stage of its writing, shifting an existential experience into a philosophical experience, justifying the murder in return. The parallel evolution of L'Invité and of the trouble Beauvoir and Sartre formed with Olga Kozakiewicz, Bianca Lamblin, et al. Has often been noted. But Beauvoir borrows less from Sartre than from his sources. The epigraph of L'Invité is very clear. Every consciousness pursues the death of the other, taken from Hegel's phenomenology of spirit. The novel just becomes an application in the computer programming sense of the term, philosophy software, which imposes its dialectic, that of the I and the other, dematerializing in a kind of providential way the cited intellectual story. The question of the body, in effect, constituted the muted thread of L'Invité, which the novel attempts to push away or to sublate, in the Hegelian sense of the word, aufheben. In other words, the intellectualization is here the signal of a repression. The return of the repressed shows up in the breakup of the heterosexual couple's unity through the breakthrough of the other, the character of Xavier, who throughout the whole novel is impeccably becoming woman. It's me or her, and it will be me, thinks Françoise before the final scene. In his L'Invité as novel of the gays, French writer Maurice Blanchot states that if almost all of the novel is written in the third person, it is because there is a hidden I. Françoise is the hidden I. Thus, I'm quoting him, if there is in the presence of Françoise someone who says I, she must at the same time realize that for this unreachable I, she's herself no longer anything but an indistinct on. Something that does not exist, or that exists precisely as something and not as a person, says Blanchot. So if the distant she becomes I, then the narrator becomes an object. This process of objectification is also providing sexual excitation in an ambivalent mode. In L'Invité, a whole network of voracious images is focalized around Xavier's mouth, which becomes redder and redder and redder, colored by the citation of usual metaphors used in the 19th century pour les femmes damnées, or rather, the spectacle of sexualized femininity. In the attraction and repulsion she manifests, Françoise's transformation into an object accompanies her realization that she's endowed with a body and a sexuality. And it's through homosexual desire that it comes to her, and it comes to stay. In the social and cultural space of the 40s, Françoise's desire for Xavier works as an escape from the hetero-centered patriarchy, defining the patriarchal cultural norms surrounding the feminine body and the erotic experiences of women. The two women let themselves go, the one against the other. Françoise feels Xavier weighs against her. They brush up against one another. They dance together. Such visualizations are painted according to Françoise's timid point of view. But as Sarah Fishwick has noted in her The Body into the Work of Simone de Beauvoir, Xavier's much more curious gaze also puts into play an evocation of a corporeality and a polymorphous sexuality. It is from Xavier's point of view that trans or intersexual characters are evoked, as well as a lesbian couple encountered in a nightclub. She calls them pederasts. It's funny that Michael Lucey this morning has made an allusion to the chapter of Violette Leduc published in Les Temps Modernes, which is exactly the same character which are actually represented, the lesbian couple and the trans character. It's funny to find that in Beauvoir's L'Invité. Much has been said of the chapter on the lesbian in The Second Sex and of the ambiguity threaded in this categorization for Beauvoir. But one should also refer to the context Manifest of L'invité, published in 1943 during the Nazi occupation and the Vichy regime. If there is no legislation specifically concerning lesbians, there is nonetheless a repressive use of the Napoleonic Code, which is permitted by two of its articles, indecent behavior and incitement to immorality, which the Vichy regime made a bit more acute in its Article 334 of the law that established sexual majority for heterosexuals at 15 years of age and for homosexuals at 21. This article would be eventually repealed in 1982. A teacher until 1943, Simone de Beauvoir is subject to an inspection by the education authorities, then by the police. The mother of Nathalie Sorokin, one of Simone's dangerous liaisons, had formally pressed charges for inciting a minor into debauchery. Nathalie Sorokin was actually 20 years old, which is not so young, but it's still. Simone is excluded from teaching with public education until 1945. While the police couldn't find any proof, this must have left her a mark on her, and particularly in L'Invité, where lesbianism is denied, a disavowal that is extended into the second sex, another autobiographical project. It is only in 1978 that Simone will say that she was not frank about her sexual life. Desire functions here as a disruption in the time of the narration. It acts as a regret, a form of nostalgia for what was not. This non-event physically actually transforms the body of Françoise, who sees herself kind of shrinking, while Xavier's remains fresh and free, she writes. If the passage into action is repressed, then its very repression acts upon the narrative. Now I shall go to La Bâtarde. Or maybe I should add that Barbara Clough and Sarah Fishwick have insisted on the two censored episodes of the published version of L'Invité. These were episodes where Françoise turned back to her sexual education and to the transmission of female sexuality, both as stains transmitted from mother to daughter. By sacrificing adolescent sexuality in the excluded chapters of L'Invité, Beauvoir has indeed erased the social prohibition and thus a possible explanation for the reasons of the narrator's corporal inhibition. So, Leduc, on the other hand, oh shit. I didn't put all my quotations, but if you want to see them back, we'll go back to them afterwards, okay? La Bâtarde. Violette Leduc read L'Invité very closely. I'm quoting her. A woman had written this book, I was at peace with myself, she writes in La Bâtarde. We talked at length yesterday, and we also talked today about the complexities of the relation between Beauvoir and Leduc, and the role of Beauvoir's preface to La Bâtarde. La Bâtarde manuscript consists of 26 notebooks on squared pages, plus one unnumbered one. Catherine Cusset has extensively written about the corporal reality woven in the writing processes of Leduc. La Bâtarde is indeed the product of a labor of writing that also qualify, or rather disqualify, as we will see further, as bastard. Violette Leduc's life story doesn't follow the linear and patriarchal chronology followed, for instance, by Simone de Beauvoir L'Invité. Leduc's could more qualify as a bastard version of La Recherche, since its coming to writing constitutes the end of La Bâtarde, while its beginning is constituted by a kind of reverie, a lateness, a kind of delay. The confessional mode is displaced in order to give a representation of oneself and to directly transpose one's experience into images, as Isabelle de Courtivant explains. And that means that, as Leduc says in La Folie en Tête, to write with one hand and with the other, I loved myself in order to love them, to join up with them, to translate them, or not to translate them. In La Bâtarde, the verb tenses are constantly passing from the past to the present and from the present to the past, so that the indexation of the time of writing is mixed with the acts used for remembrance, such as masturbation, in order to inform the image provoked into writing. And finally, with the time of the event to which she refers without distance. One must relate this telescoping of tenses and durations to the very fabric of what is written. The diverse textures that compose the text proceed from the recycling of fragments previously written, cut up again, and recomposed into a new work. So I was drawn into showing you, to compare it with Claude Carin's, or rather Marcel Moore and Claude Carin's work, and their use of photography particularly. Montage is a material event, linked to the censorship of the first novel of Violette, and a third work, Ravage, where page after page, lesbian sex between two middle school girls were cut on the publisher's order. The censored pages are first published by Jacques Guérin in a luxury edit of 28 copies, from which Leduc, we learned that, had to refabricate, remake a manuscript. Montage again. The censored sexual scenes reappropriated for Thérèse et Isabelle Deluxe edition return in 30 pages of La Bâtarde. And then, 2 years later, in 1966, it is recuperated by Leduc's publisher, but in an edited form, because the unexpurgated version of Thérèse et Isabelle will come out in 2000. So, montage is a political matter too. Illegitimate birth, lesbian and non-lesbian sexual relations, prostitution, et al. Are described in La Bâtarde along with amorous feelings for homosexual men. Here too, La Bâtarde encourages a kaleidoscope reading of a non-heterosexual and non-patriarchal experience. Thus is the speaking otherwise, to which Leduc lays claim, traversed and produced not only by the narrative, but of non-heterosexual sexualities, but also by the reuse and citation of this narrative from one book to another, reenacting and repairing along the social disgust voiced by censorship. Like L'Invité, La Bâtarde is also a coming-of-age novel of Violette, a feminine subject whose destiny seems predetermined by her illegitimacy. The encounters and relationships, formative and painful, makes the exchange between the character and the narrator possible. In other words, and we talked about this at length this morning, the insult bastard, which names the painful destiny of Violette, can be turned back into Violette Leduc's La Bâtarde, a literary production where writing allows a narrative voice to be heard. We return here to the performativity of insult and its subversive potential, which makes this coming to writing possible. This theatricalization of the narrative, which performs the insult, is accompanied by the continual interrelation of the reader, which constitutes the operation par excellence of the lyric poem. When it is written that they discover the world between their legs, one sees that two things are linked in the eye of Violette. The encounter, the eye, I mean myself, of Violette. The encounter with Isabelle constitutes a discovery of sexuality, awakening one after the other, parts of the body that she does not know, and that will be conjugated lyrically to images one must learn by writing them down. Arousal is translated through the transformation of writing, which starts poor, the poverty of my vocabulary discouraged me, Leduc writes, and which little by little increases. My irritated flesh became caress, my hip being flattered, irradiated into my drag legs, into my soft ankles. I was being tortured teeny in my belly. And then it explodes in more and more metaphor. This has become a sexual experience reenacted or performed through the process of metaphorization. The pleasure of sex is performed into the pleasure of the text, where the pleasure in writing and the writing into pleasure, as Bâtarde would say, converge. Leduc shows in a spectacular way how repetition inhabits this pleasure and constitutes its recurrent fantasies, repeated identically within La Bâtarde. So clearly, the relationship with Hermine, represents another side of non-heterosexual experience, what I call Violette Leduc moment. Their moving in together is stated in very few words. The parents know without knowing, and then theatricality invades the sexual terrain of writing about Hermine's large breasts in her corsage, about her gypsy thighs in her skirt. The relationship is transported onto the terrain of viewing and of having, of commodification of the gaze, with an increasingly important place being given to hairdressing, makeup, and clothes, like the eel-colored suit, for instance, or the Schiaparelli suit, for instance. In other words, to the relation to the social norms of masculinity and femininity. But it's never enough, never good enough. Violette never sees herself beautiful enough to be satisfied and falls into melancholy and despondency, that very melancholy that Judith Butler has theorized into gender melancholy. Testimony for that can be found in the scene of the Concorde Bridge, where Hermine and Violette are walking, just having bought clothes at Schiaparelli's, and then the narrator is insulted by a heterosexual passerby, an episode that lasts for several pages, over the course of which we embody the humiliation. And we know further that what she has said is that if I had a face like hers, I would kill myself. Violette Leduc's constant mention of her ugliness is related to the social stigmatization of homosexuality, her abject selves, in short. I'm ugly, equaling I'm a dyke. Those two propositions can be both considered as deviation from canonic femininity, and and also the fag hag into Violette. Leduc specifies in La Bâtarde that she reads Rimbaud, Proust, Gide, Cocteau, Maurice Sacks, Jean Genet, not lesbian writers. She mentions Adrienne Monnier in her bookstore, with whom she apparently was infatuated with, but Violette is above all a fag hag. The person who has the best and most cruelly spoken of fag hags is Hilton Arls, the New Yorker theater critic who in his book The Woman devotes a long chapter to the extraordinary Dorothy Dean, an African-American woman who galvanized gay social life around her, first in Cambridge, where she graduated, and then in Warhol's factory, thanks to her extraordinary talent for eloquence and conversation. So it's important for us to address Violette Leduc's passion with gay men as a component of a life and writing that fought everywhere, the bastard battle, to cite the title of my favorite novels of Céline Minard's. Even in her passion for gay men, Leduc was again confronted with illegitimacy and writing out the femininity of her female body. Illegitimate in the eyes of the norm, whether of class, of gender, of race, of sexuality, of beauty, of sanity, of happiness, of choice of sexual object. The Eye of La Bâtarde, published and uncensored this time, construct itself publicly, that is, in front of our reading eyes. Monique Wittig. When you've read The Well of Loneliness, the poems of Sylvie Plath and Anaïs Nin, Violette Leduc's La Bâtarde, you've read everything, writes Monique Wittig. Clearly, we strive to make the list, she strived to make the list much longer. Like La Bâtarde, like She Came to Stay, Le Bobonax is a novel. It was published the same year as La Bâtarde. It also allows for a return to one or several formative experiences of life in 7 long, untitled chapters, without paragraphs, and all in the present. It has been said that on dit, you say, one says, is the exact opposite of it was said that. Le Bobonax, the writing, reenacts in the present tense a childhood which could pass for a fairy tale if in fairy tales the children could be totally emancipated from parents, family, class, and gender, as McCarthy has noted. The novel doesn't allude to the father-mother construction, nor to Oedipus, nor to an inverted Oedipus, nor to maternity, nor to the prohibition on incest. At one point, one can notice that there is a Véronique Legrand and a Catherine Legrand, which would mean that they're sisters, but it's a novel without them. As Georges Perec beautifully articulated in La Disparition, a novel without E. And you know, in French, a novel without E, you say un roman sans eux, which means without them, of course, and without the parents. So maybe you can read also that the title, Le Poponax, is without E, c'est sans eux. So, in the same way, names are always given in their entirety. Naming people by their first and last name refuses infantilization and is associated with the place where the action takes place, the school, with the roll call. The school where you learn to write and where you learn to read. A novel without the primitive scene, without the binary of the daddy-mommy, how does it work? Monique Wittig has found this incredible device, the French on. In French, as Beauvoir has written elsewhere, we have to drag gender around everywhere in language. In French, one always has to choose between the feminine and the masculine. Monique Wittig doesn't choose, or rather Monique Wittig chooses the proper name and she chooses the on. And through this, the French language gets rid of the discursive grammatical constraints tied to the speaker's gender. This on is endowed with a voice and a complicity too. On dit in French, they say, are authorless rumors repeated from mouth to mouth and difficult to control. They made the fabric of Nathalie Sarraud's novel, and Sarraud was Wittig's friend. My writing has always been indissolubly tied to a prohibited sexual practice, lesbianism. I started writing around 12 or 13 when I fell in love with a little girl, says Wittig in 1973. This prohibited sexual practice is first manifested through names put together, Catherine Legrand Valérie Borges, with no punctuation. And then through two linguistic formulations that designate their amorous exchange, the use of on dit, and an I who intervenes to say, I am the Poponax. Je suis le Poponax. What or who is the Poponax? This is what TV journalist Pierre Dumayet questions to Monique Wittig for the television program Lecture pour tous. Pierre Dumayet more or less formulates the hypothesis that one should look for it with Catherine Legrand Valérie Borges, but the person filming the interview might already have a better reading of the thing. As soon as the word Le Poponax arrive, there's a cut in the image. One sees Wittig in profile behind a curtain of hair, a kind of lock of hair that you see here, that covers her up. And then one sees her hands manipulating things, a newspaper nearby, and you see immediately that the hands are not, endowed with feminine or masculine characteristics. There are hands manipulating the materiality of the newspaper, the materiality of the table. And then you have the kind of smile, strange smile of Monique. So it seems that the camera person knows what the Poponax could be or should be. So I'm going back to the quotation. Yesterday, Lynne Huffer talked about the new materialism of speculative realism, to which Monique Wittig's old materialism fought for another wandering eco-poiesis. I'd like here to argue for a base materialism, that is to refer to Georges Bataille's informe, formless. Like Le Poponax, Georges Bataille refuses to define positively the formless in the critical dictionary of the Journal Document in 1929-1930. It is not an adjective with any given meaning, but a term that serves to declassify, he writes, or a taxonomical disorder to be operated. The formless is nothing in and of itself and has no existence other than an operatory one. Le Poponax is also performative. Like the formless, its operation intervenes to put things outside their place. Form and content, but also form and matter, interior and exterior, masculine, feminine, child, adult, homo, hetero, etc. These last categories were unfortunately not mentioned in the exhibition Formless, a User's Guide, curated by Rosalind Krauss and Yves Alain Bois in 1996. Too bad. The Opoponax operates through citations, like gender does. But Catherine Legrand convokes in her anonymous letters, love relations, are phrases from Louise Labbé, Béatrice de Provence, Tibulle, Baudelaire, Malherbe, etc. It has been noted that the registers of the citations used pushes towards erudite culture, the Odyssée, Pascal's Pensée, the Flower Evil, etc. And also that the erudite intertextuality convokes words and authors deemed secondary. Tibullus more than Ovid, the Georgics more than the Aeneid, the Chanson de Guillaume more than the Chanson de Roland. But each time, the amorous emotion is expressed through verses cited without quotation marks in the text, so they're cannibalized by the text. Catherine Legrand wakes up saying, and already before me the countryside is home. This is from Malherbe, while Valérie Borges lifts her head. Where's my last page? Okay. Bad, good or ugly, the story of the self, as stated in the three novels, seems far away from the typically confessional mode of writing associated with the feminine memoirs. Reading these three novels made me realize the historical dimension of the normative buttressing against which writing hits and which it tries to resist. From constructive denial in Beauvoir, to montage alongside with lyrical repetition in Leduc, and to generalization and citation in critique, the terrain is here provided for that struggle in which both the private and the public self will be redefined. Between 1943 with L'Invité and 1964 with La Bâtarde and Le Opoponax, a breach is opened in writing. I have insisted here in my citations on the passages from the she to the on in the Opoponax, and from the she of Thérèse, from Thérèse and Isabelle, to the I from Violette in La Bâtarde. So we pass from the she to the on in the case of Monique Wittig, and the she to the I in La Bâtarde. Associated with non-heterocentral desires, they construct and document a history of bodies and of their identifications. We could say here that their shifts in perspective write a history of sexuality to the extent that they know how writing acts on the body and the weight of the body, as one could say in lesbian speech, when it touches and affects writing. Thank you.
I want to pay a very, I could say, formalistic tribute to Violette Leduc, and by formalistic I mean personal. I mean the confessional mode of writing that Violette Leduc invented. And of course I will talk a lot of Violette Leduc. When I try to remember my childhood, or when memories of my childhood strike me against any decision of my own, it is the rage which hits me the strongest. The story of my childhood is a story of rage and anger. I don't recall a single day in which my mother wasn't standing in front of the television screaming at the politicians, they are all the same. Not a single day in which my dad wasn't complaining about the doctor of the village or the mayor, saying that they were always against us and against our best interest. By us, he meant those without money, the ones who never went to high school, the jobless, the hopeless. My grandmother also screamed, and probably her mother and father before her. The screams were passed down from one generation to the other, but the screams saved no one from their destiny, because we didn't know what to do with these screams. They were there, among us, encumbering us. We didn't know to whom they should be addressed, except to the television, which always remained cold and placid. We were uncertain of who was responsible for our unhappiness. It would change according to nightly news. We had to avoid screaming in front of other people because my mother always told us that complaining would give us a bad reputation. Plus, even when she was screaming, she would never talk about suffering for fear of being seen as a complainer. She even said she was not suffering after all from a violent situation. Like, for example, a situation as a woman. It was violence, and she called it life. Because of all of this, as Aimé Césaire said, we always passed, deterred by our screams, our cries. Quote, and in this inert town, this crawling throng so astonishingly deterred from its true cry, as this town has been, from its movement, from its meaning, not even worried, deterred from its true cry. I had a particularly humiliating memory of lost cry. My father became a street sweeper after an accident at the factory, left him unable to do his job. One day, during election time, a politician, a minister of the government, visited my father's place of work, his damn corner of the basement. My father had always hated this man and would frequently insult him whenever he appeared on television. When he saw the minister arrive, crowned by his status, in the clothes and his intimidating demeanor, encircled by his bodyguard and aides, my father didn't dare say anything. He kept silence, although he was suddenly humiliated by all the attributes of power. He came home and said that he hadn't confronted the minister. In fact, they joked around together. He had it. He thought he wasn't such an asshole after all, but kind of a good guy. I felt wounded by this reason, precisely because it was my parents who had taught me to hate this man. I believe that what so deeply moved me when I discovered the books of Violette Leduc was a cascade of shouts and complaints. Bâtarde famously begging, for example. My case is not unique. I am afraid of dying and distressed at being in this world. I haven't worked, I haven't studied, I have wept, I have cried out in protest. These tears and cries have taken up a great deal of my time. I am tortured by all the time lost whenever I think about it. I cannot think about things for long, but I can find pleasure in a limp letter sleeve offering me nothing but regrets to chew over. There is no sustenance in the past. I shall depart as I arrived. I am loaded down with the defects that have tormented me. I wish I had been born a statue. I am a slug under his dunghill. Virtues, good qualities, courage, meditation, culture. With the arm crossed on my breast, I have broken myself against those words. So she shouts, she cries, she moans. Her complaints are the material of her writing. She addresses her cries to others, to the world, to Simone de Beauvoir, to the readers. Violette Leduc knows to cry, how to cry. Her complaints touch us because they provide us another way to live and exist, which is, in her case, a way of screaming. Because when I try to remember my mother, my sister, and the disordered rants, I tell myself that they failed where Violette Leduc succeeded, because she turned her screams, her cries, her lamentation into an instrument of transformation. She says in La Folie en Tête, there is an ambition, a desire behind this manner of being. Quote, to cry louder, that's the goal for which I strive. Who could rescue me if I didn't have my source? Violette Leduc complains because she asks for help, because she wants to be rescued. And what is so beautiful in saying this is that we understand that her becoming is something which takes place outside of her too. She complains to bring close this externality, this rescue. And what I believe, and what I will try to point out today, is that we can find in this way of thinking, pushed as far as Violette Leduc did, a very powerful reflection about what becoming and becoming free and autonomous means. Violette Leduc was perhaps the only writer who broke away from the figure of the hero who haunts the memoir, and particularly the memoirs of what sociology calls the class transfugees, those rare individuals who weren't born into a privileged and intellectual milieu, but who, as Violette Leduc, as James Baldwin, or Peter Handke, or Didier Eribon, became writers, even if they had, of course, very different childhood. I remember when I read Notes of a Native Song by James Baldwin or A Sorrow Beyond Dreams by Peter Handke. I take these authors, though I could take many others like Pierre Bourdieu. When I read these books, I was unsettled by the impression that these authors had always wanted to be authors, were born authors, or in a more general way, were always different and always more free than their peers. They had always been more free than the other, and the story of the first part of their life looked like a struggle against their circumstances, a struggle against the milieu into which they had accidentally been born. These people, the transfugees, were always already free in an alienated world where they fought to become something else against and despite their milieu in order to achieve their difference. James Baldwin writes, any writer, I suppose, feels that the world into which he was born is nothing less than a conspiracy against the cultivation of his talent, which attitude certainly has a great deal to support it. Of course, there are many people who helped them. We know the elementary school teacher of Albert Camus, or the one who takes young James Baldwin to the theater. Of course, there are uncertainties, like Pierre Bourdieu, who hesitates between adhering to the scholastic system and pursuing the virilist values of his milieu, which encourage him to reject school. But these elements are always either supplemental or peripheral to the innate desire for escape, the will to flee, the forced flight. Most of the time, as Didier Eribon revealed about the auto-analysis of Pierre Bourdieu, the transfugees keep silent about the probable origin of their difference, which is just another way of letting us think that they always were, in a dormant state, what they became. The will to flee seems to have always been present. The difficulty comes not from the creation of the will, but from the struggle of the will against unfavorable circumstances. I despaired in reading the lines of James Baldwin, Pierre Bourdieu, or Peter Handke. When I read them, around the time I was 18 years old, I started to feel the need to write. But if I tried to remember my childhood, I didn't see myself as a child always already free, and even less as a born writer. I had written some little text or poem for Mother's Day because I was forced, just like all the other children. And I didn't do it like a task which would have unveiled what I was dreaming for my future. On the contrary, my childhood had been a story of a struggle not to flee, where I did everything in my capacity to fit in. I was a gay child, a queer child, effeminate, and I was ashamed of my parents because they always dreamed of having as a son a real boy, a tough guy. They found in their arm a skinny little boy with a high voice who hated soccer and who wanted to play with dolls. When we were around their friends, they would lower their eyes whenever I would speak because they were ashamed of my intonations and what I was saying. So I had the same dreams as them of conforming to what I was presented to me as normal. I had wanted to follow the model set by the popular kids in school. I had dreamed that they wouldn't lower their eyes when I spoke. I hadn't always dreamed of living, even less of writing. I had a thought many years later while reading Notes of a note of a native soul. If I hadn't always been different, wasn't it the proof that I would never be? Was something missing when I was born? I thought, wasn't it the proof that I would never be a writer? It seems to me that one of the risks taken by James Baldwin or Peter Handke in speaking of the trajectories was to make literature as an object of contemplation rather than a principle of action. If the writer transfuges are born different, extraordinary, then they are not ordinary. And in this fact, they maintain the frontier with the ordinary and a fortiori with the masses. Because of their extreme rarity, their trajectory becomes a thing we contemplate. What becomes fascinating in the life of the transfuge is precisely these extraordinary and unknowable characteristics. The beauty of her life, of his life, is rightly its distance in relation to that of the reader. It's this suffering at the frontiers that I have experienced and which Violette Leduc can free us. Violette Leduc completely breaks free from the myth of the autonomy of the will, and she substitutes for this myth a much more generous and inclusive approach. She speaks in L'Asphyxie about her desire to fit in. She speaks in La Folie en Tête. She describes her as someone who dreams of having been a street sweeper, for example. The force of Violette Leduc, compared to the other authors who wrote on this subject, is that she problematized the difference between the transfuge and the surroundings, as she makes it as a political statement, a central question of her writing. She succeeds in illustrating the difference between the transfuge and her peers without precisely reproducing the distance. In fact, she wasn't born different, she became different. It's not because the other made her as a bastard that she's a bastard, that she feels different. There is like a failure, there is like a fracture here in the becoming of Violette Leduc. Contrary to James Baldwin, Violette Leduc writes about herself in La Folie en Tête. Vocation, none. And then she became Violette Leduc. When we read these quotes, vocation, none, and we see that the same person who wrote this sentence, wrote La Bâtarde, wrote Thérèse et Isabelle, wrote L'Asphyxie, we can feel much more welcomed, because even those who were born without vocation, who were born in a milieu where it was not possible to have vocation, we can still imagine for them a destiny out of the ordinary. And maybe James Baldwin and Peter Handke are mistaken to take up the ideology of the bourgeoisie, where the literary ambition can be inculcated so young that it gives the impression that they have always had this ambition in them. I am thinking of the words of Jean-Paul Sartre too, for example. This vision would be therefore a vision of the bourgeoisie, which could function above all for the bourgeoisie, in contrast to the approach, the much more generous approach of Violette Leduc. Violette Leduc says it was first the writer, Maurice Sachs, who put the pen in her hands, and then, in meeting Simone de Beauvoir, that she found the ambition and energy to write her work. For sometimes, she lives with Maurice Sachs, this man that she, I quote, loves and who intimidates her. Violette Leduc trusts him. She tells him about her violent childhood, this childhood as a bastard, which she had lived. And in hearing these memories, Maurice Sachs tells her, your unhappy childhood is starting to piss me off. This afternoon, take your sack, your fountain pen, your notebook, and write. So Violette Leduc writes, I was willing to obey Maurice. He encourages her to keep going, my dear Violette. You only have to keep going, he told me. Several years later, when she stops seeing Maurice Sachs and attaches herself to Simone de Beauvoir, she maintains the same relationship to writing. This is another important point about Violette Leduc's wailing and screaming, because her cries and shouts inform us not on the difficulty of fighting against a conspiracy, as Jane Baldwin, but the difficulty of becoming, particularly in the difficulty of becoming different. It's in the self-identification, in admiring Simone de Beauvoir, in loving that which was outside of her, that she wrote. She became different for Simone de Beauvoir. She said, I would look everywhere in vain for this labor of writing if I haven't seen her after 15 days. She said, I recount my life. To write became my life. Must I continue to recount it? Mustn't I? If I stop, I delete Simone de Beauvoir. We can't not see the irreducible opposition between Baldwin Anker and Violette Leduc and the manners of presenting that becoming. In insisting on the importance of the others, of Simone de Beauvoir, of Maurice Sachs, she pushes past the point of destruction the image of the innate writer. She offers possibility to those who have been destined to nothingness by society. She cries because of the difficulty of constructing the difference. It's not a difficulty of being different. In placing emphasis on these sufferings, she puts emphasis on a process. Between these two models, there is a difference, above all, in tempo, in the chronology, and the chronological order of Violette Leduc is immensely more welcoming and more open. I mean, in any case, that it welcomed me. Obviously, the fact that what she became came from the outside doesn't mean that Violette Leduc isn't autonomous. It doesn't mean that she's condemned to spend her whole life in the shadow of Simone de Beauvoir and that she renounces her singularity and originality. It is precisely through this process of identification and admiration that Violette Leduc earned her autonomy. Her liberty comes from admiration. With Violette Leduc, to admire is not to submit, rather a means of self-liberation. I have known many people who attest to wanting not resembling someone and of not admiring anyone because they wanted to remain different. A couple of years ago, when I was working in a bookshop to earn a little money, there was always some people who introduced themselves as authors and who would drop off manuscripts at the bookshop and ask us to pass them along to editors. Many would say that they never read a book, out of fear of admiring other writers and being influenced. I had never imagined before this job that there were thousands of people everywhere who were writing without ever having read, for fear of being influenced and losing that which they believe made them different. One only had to thumb through the manuscripts to see that they were nothing more than the recitations of all the most ordinary urges and categories of thought of the social world. Like the people Violette Leduc meets when she works for a publisher, what they call the autonomy was the most perfect realization of the author heteronomy. They were falling into the trap because they were condemned to be nothing other than what which society has made of them. That which they called the difference was in fact exactly what society had placed inside of them. Violette Leduc, however, through her admiration of Simone de Beauvoir, achieved the difference. She doesn't have to find it hidden somewhere inside of her, whether she must commit herself to creating it, which includes becoming different from Simone de Beauvoir. And this is why the cries of the becoming continue. I walk into an ambush, she says. They seized me to take me to the table, to open my inkwell, to guide my hand on the paper. She says of Simone de Beauvoir, write, remember. It's what she wants you to do. She repeats, write, remember. It's what she wants. Again, she said, La Femme, this book in which each page, each line, each word was written for her. We see Simone de Beauvoir is a major figure who unleashes the will within Violette Leduc to construct her difference. When she sees for the first time a book of Simone de Beauvoir on the desk of Maurice Sacks, she says, I read the name of Simone de Beauvoir, then the title, L'Invité. It was a woman who wrote this book. Later, she read the books of Simone de Beauvoir, and she says in La Folie en Tête, a woman wrote in place of millions of women, as if all women were capable of writing. So it means that Violette Leduc points out not only the invention of the difference, but she questions the origin of the invention. She finds herself and recognizes herself in Simone de Beauvoir. A woman writes, she will be therefore able to write. Simone de Beauvoir, through the manifestation of her existence, makes possible the existence of others. I remember having experienced the same thing in reading Returning to Rest by Didier Eribon. When I discovered it, I was a freshman in college, and I was pursuing a diploma which had been worth next to nothing in the marketplace for a long time in a devalued university. But I didn't realize this because in my family we were not familiar with the education system and its hierarchies. My father dropped out of school at 15. He said he was bored at school and that he preferred to spend his day working on his mop in the garage. His 6 brothers and sisters were all born like him between the end of the 60s and the end of the 70s. All of them, without exception, dropped off school at around the same age. My mother dropped out at 16 when she became pregnant with my older brother, and we only need to know the destiny of my parents in order to get the destiny of my brothers and sisters. So when I entered my first year at the university, the scholastic distance from my family was so great that it gave me the impression that I had crossed over every layer of society. My mother would tell everyone what I was doing, emotionally touched that I was making the master's studies. When I read Returning to Rest, I thought, this is my life, like Violette Leduc with Simone de Beauvoir. It was a story of a gay child of the working class, which recounts how he had escaped his birthplace to live in Paris and become an author, invited to the best university in the world with Elisabeth, for example. Nearly all of his friends were authors. I remember reading the book on the bus, unable to put it down. When I read the chapters where Didier Eribon speaks of social classes and of the working class, I was proud to be reading his book. I would hold it high for everyone to see and make sure I didn't put my finger over the book cover so everyone would know what I was reading. And they would see me as an intellectual. Obviously, when the chapter spoke of homosexuality, I would blush and hide the book, suddenly reading very discreetly, although the people around me on the bus could have seen in my eyes what I was reading and insulted me. Like Violette Leduc, I found myself in a book and suddenly my existence became legitimate. I wasn't alone anymore. I felt reinforced. This rhetoric of recognition largely dominates the social effects of the reading. Annie Ernaux, for example, says the same thing about her own readings of Pierre Bourdieu. And then, little by little, the truth imposed itself on me. This book, Returning to Rest, wasn't my story. I hadn't even accepted my homosexuality yet. I didn't live in Paris. I was frequenting by writers. I hardly ever read, much less thought about writing. Since I have come to understand that literature is maybe less a space of recognition, a space where we can find our own lives, as it often says, and more a space of fantasies, a space of lies. In saying to myself, Returning to Rest is a story of my life, I created myself a fantasy, a lie. But this lie, after much repetition, eventually has an effect on my way of perceiving myself, and it was able to become true. It is this space of fantasy which opens itself up to Violette Leduc when she discovers Simone de Beauvoir. As she said, a woman wrote in place of millions of women, as if all women were capable of writing. Thus, all at once, Simone de Beauvoir, being what she is, by what she represents through her books, gives Violette Leduc a space where she can fantasize about herself differently, as a writer, and also as a woman who considers all the implications of her status as a woman in a masculinist society. She can dream of a life of which she would have never thought to dream. How much time do you have? How much time? Okay, need 2 minutes. This identification is partly impossible because Violette Leduc doesn't have the same story as Simone de Beauvoir, and she knows it. I will never be Simone de Beauvoir, she says. But this mistake, this identification troubled, allows her to say things that Simone de Beauvoir never said, for example, about lesbianism. She wants to write about herself because Simone de Beauvoir did, but because they are not the same at all, what she writes, what she says, is different. Simone de Beauvoir creates a space of fantasy and beneficial errors for Violette Leduc, just as Violette Leduc does today for us. The cries of Violette Leduc reveals to us the violence of the fantasy too, of course. This meeting with Simone de Beauvoir is also violent for this reason, because Violette Leduc realized what was left to do, what was left to write. Simone de Beauvoir writes in the place of. Therefore, she shows also that all women, to the contrary of Simone de Beauvoir, do not write. I also recall this suffering when I returning to Reims, because suddenly I saw all that I wasn't, and thus what I was, since what we are is also defined by that which we are not, by our position in the world. In this sense, I can say that I waited until I was 17 to be born as the son of my father. I was thinking I had accomplished my dreams in becoming a freshman at a little university. I realized that I hadn't even begun to dream. At the moment where I thought I had come to the end of my life, it was the beginning. I believe that it is what Violette Leduc feels in getting to know Simone de Beauvoir. She realizes that her relationship with Maurice Sachs was only the first step. It suffices to see the shame that she felt for him in the years after the relationship. The same guy who she had been intimidated by, and in relation to whom she had kept silent and felt insignificant. The fantasy and the suffering which are provoked by Simone de Beauvoir come from the realization of the part of Violette Leduc, of the possibility of her own emancipation. Because this suffering is an inclusive suffering, which derives from the becoming, contrary to the suffering which I was speaking before, and that I felt in reading Baldwin or Anke. With James Baldwin, I suffered from the belief I could never be that which he was, whereas with Violette Leduc, I suffered precisely because I now knew what I could be. The greatness of Violette Leduc cries is that we learn to suffer with her. Isn't one of the major roles of great political movements to teach us how to suffer? The feminist movement reveals what hadn't largely been perceived before, but was taken for granted, the idea of gender, for example, and the fact that women are constituted as an innate category. So suffering is produced by an act of knowledge, an instance of marine. The feminist movement ruptured the frontier between affects and intellect. Gender and domination were there, but before the feminist movement, before Simone de Beauvoir, before Monique Wittig, before Violette Leduc, we didn't consider them automatically as an object of discourse and not as objects of suffering. The feminist movement reveals these realities, and from this revelation, it teaches us how to know how to suffer, the condition of being a woman, and this suffering is the starting point of its revolt. By placing suffering at the heart of a discourse, of a writing, Violette Leduc placed it there as a revolt.
I was surprised not to hear Jeannelle mentioned during this panel. And relatedly, when you say, Elisabeth, that what Leduc says is I'm ugly, I'm a dyke, and I'm a fag hag. She says I'm ugly all the time. She never says I'm a dyke, to my knowledge. And in fact, she's not one. Her sexual preference has become clear in everything that she wrote was people who would never want to sleep with her. But in fact, Simone de Beauvoir, and so I think it's important to, I think that a lot of what you said, I agree with most of what you said, but I think it's important to recognize that, first of all, that Leduc never says, I'm a dyke, and she's not one, and in fact, I think that Simone de Beauvoir put her finger on something extremely, something at the very heart of Leduc's being and writing, which is that ultimately her effective, her most poignant, effective other is the reader, who is neither present nor absent, because she can't deal with presence and she can't feel less. I think that Beauvoir's preface to Bâtarde is very weird in many ways. For instance, her reference to the woman who's called Madame in La Famille. I mean, it's all very weird in the way that Beauvoir can be weird. But that observation seems to me to go straight to the heart of something that's very crucial to Leduc, and I just wanted to say that it's really not accurate to say that she ever says I'm dyke. She's not a dyke. She's not. But I just wanted one more thing, which is that it seems to me that Wittig's Lebovici, just Lebovici, not the rest of her work, Wittig's Lebovici, L'Invité, and Jeannelle's work all do something. In fact, in the film that we're about to see, someone remarks on something having to something related to this. They don't ever make the gesture of saying, of the coming out gesture of I know that I am different because I'm attracted to people of the same sex. They never, sexuality is entirely natural because there's so much, there isn't that, as someone says in the film that we're about to see, that bourgeois gesture of coming out, oh, here's why I feel different, it's because I'm homosexual. And so I just thought it was important to know.
No, I totally agree with you, Elisabeth. I was saying in my little thing that for me it was something since I did, it's of my fantasy of the book, okay? Like this book helped me, it helped me to imagine something, and indeed.
So you say you're a dyke.
Exactly. No, is that I think that what I wanted to say is that, of course, this is something you can fantasize on, and you can actually appropriate the fantasy to yourself. I mean, the visualization is that, and there is so much in the scenes of Violette and Isabelle that I think I transferred it into the whole book. I mean, it's about sex with an unwanting object and a wanting object, and the only wanting object in the book is Isabelle. So this is how one of the only objects in the book is in a Bâtarde.
Oh, but Hermine is desiring, but then she dumps her. And then when she's been dumped, then she wants her back. I mean, it's really systematic.
So the only one who doesn't appear is Isabelle.
Yeah.
So that's how it made me. It made for me.
So she's ugly, you're dark.
Maybe a clarification, and it's related to your thoughts this morning to your talk. So I understand that Violette Leduc is no Simone de Beauvoir, and you are no Didier Eribon, even though reading Didier Eribon fiction.
Read yourself it. Sorry, you missed that.
Dirk is sad and he's at one. But so Didier Eribon tells us basically you are born a bastard and that's it, and then basically you write to deal with it or something. There is something about, it's so I hear like, I scream in an interesting way because I'm good, but I scream. And you're telling us something very different, it seems to me, which is you are not born anything, like you are free or a writer or a bastard, and you invent something. There is a process of invention, it's much more dialectical to use very well. So I'm just trying to understand what the work of writing does here. It's a very basic question, and if aesthetics plays in the writing.
No, yeah, because precisely I think that one of the questions can be are we different because even if we are constituted as different, by the others, by society, etc. So isn't it like a fracture in the self, in the person, as you exactly said before about Monique Wittig, when she speaks about lesbianism, and she said lesbian is a concept. So as say Didier Eribon, even if she feels this on her shoulder every day, and she feels the insults on her, she still doesn't feel inside of her as a lesbian. So I tried to point out this, this fracture between what Didier Eribon calls the verdict, the gay insult, etc. And how do we feel? Is it because we are constituted as difference that we are this difference? And isn't it a question of, I don't know, of temporality or something like this, where we can escape this and all these kind of things? But I think we can mix maybe your approach of Monique Wittig and the approach of Didier Eribon. It's like this plurality inside of the agents of the people, of the excluded people, and yes, because as I said during the lecture, I felt it so violently, because it's. If you say people were born different, so you said we just have to wait, for Godot, we have to wait people different to become different, and then what happened, And in insisting on the process and on this fracture, precisely, Violette Leduc, I think, gives so much more tools for emancipation.
In that sense, do you agree with what Anya would say in the value, that she's not born a woman, that she doesn't feel there is a link between her being a woman and her being from a social class, but she has a history of women, she has a sociology? Would that be something that you would formulate?
Yeah, exactly, in the same way, like this sometimes impossible meeting between the individual and history, even if this history, these social structures do change the persons, do make them suffer, etc. So their realities. It's not like you can say, no, I don't care about the others telling me that I am a lesbian or something. But you can, be insulted as something and be constituted as something, and not feeling this difference inside of you or as a history of you.
Yes. Hi. Thank you for both of the papers. First, I just thank you for both of these beautiful papers. And Edouard, I thought you made such a moving argument. You made such a moving argument for Violette Leduc and the offering she makes to write a self and how it inspired you. But I have to say I was deeply pained by your construction of Baldwin as less generous than Leduc, and as a writer who used the writing only to construct his own jumping of class or jumping of circumstance. Baldwin publicly spoke of not only being born into impoverished circumstances, but of being a fag and a nigger, and he spoke about being twice blessed that those things make him fast-paced class. And when he, in fact, had changed his circumstances and was actually living in France and was a well-known writer and was, making money and living quite a comfortable life, he made the decision to return here to fight in the civil rights movement. So I think he didn't really write only to jump his own circumstances. He actually devoted an entire life to changing the very circumstances that he was born into. And he names the problem not that he was accidentally born into the wrong circumstances, but that those circumstances shouldn't exist. So something about that construction, I was very moved by your arguments for Leduc, but making them on the shoulder of Baldwin. In this way, I was deeply pained by it, actually, and really puzzled as well.
No, it's because, of course, I have such big admiration for James Baldwin, and I think that James Baldwin gave many people the possibility of identifying themselves to him. And I just wanted to point out two different modes of problematization of the difference, because precisely James Baldwin said that he was always this kind of person, but it doesn't mean that indeed he doesn't fight, and he fought very, very strong. We all know this, and even there is an example that I like to take. It's even if this. Even if his escaping was individual, it would always... je peux parler français maintenant, je commence à me fatiguer, mais ça devient difficile. Mais même si la fuite de James Baldwin avait été une fuite absolument individuelle, etc., même s'il ne s'était pas battu comme il l'avait fait ensuite contre la ségrégation, contre le racisme, etc., de toute façon, cette fuite individuelle aurait toujours déjà été une fuite collective. Parce que je crois qu'il n'y a pas de distinction entre les deux. Il n'y a pas de fuite individuelle qui ne soit déjà collective. Et cet exemple dont je parlais, que j'aime beaucoup, c'est par exemple précisément l'exemple de ce qu'on appelait Great Migration, de toutes ces personnes, de toutes les personnes noires qui fuyaient les États esclavagistes du Sud pour aller vers le Nord. Et moi, ce que je trouve absolument magnifique dans cet exemple-là, c'est que chaque personne qui fuyait individuellement, chaque personne qui fuyait avec sa famille, rendait pour les autres la fuite comme quelque chose de pensable, comme quelque chose de possible, comme un modèle imitable, etc. Tout à fait comme je l'ai dit à propos de Simone de Beauvoir, qui rend des vies d'un seul coup pensables et possibles. Et donc évidemment, à beaucoup d'égards, James Baldwin a fourni. Bien sûr, je suis un peu dur avec lui, mais c'est parce que je veux tordre le bâton dans l'autre sens et montrer ce que Violette Leduc a ajouté de plus par rapport à lui. Et on peut dire, même si James Baldwin a permis des identifications, combien d'identifications en plus on aurait si on faisait proliférer le modèle de Violette Leduc. Mais évidemment, je pense que je dis ça avec une totale admiration pour le travail politique de James Baldwin. Bien sûr, donc vous avez raison, on est toujours un peu dur dans ces cas-là.
Juste une petite remarque, c'est intéressant ce que vous disiez justement pour former une communauté de femmes qui en effet de lesbiennes sont totalement possibles dans ces textes. Pardon. Et former une communauté de transfuges a l'air quand même très différent. Dans le sens où je me demande si en fait le transfuge peut vraiment se reproduire ou se multiplier ou proliférer. À la fin du texte d'Annie Ernaux-Laplace, elle rencontre une de ses étudiantes, elle est venue caissière, elle n'a pas réussi à transformer l'essai qu'elle avait elle-même fait. Donc je me demande si la prolifération se fait vraiment selon les mêmes thèmes, les mêmes termes.
Non, vous avez raison de votre nom. C'est sûr qu'effectivement, il y a cette question de la transmission et de la reproduction qui est posée, et qui est posée d'ailleurs à travers ces trois textes, d'un certain point de vue. Et du lien qui est fait dans ce colloque entre ces trois textes, c'est-à-dire quelle histoire commune dans ces trois textes, est-ce qu'on peut les faire voyager dans cette histoire commune, et comment se repérer dans cette histoire commune, dans cet espace commun qui est créé. Et c'est évidemment la question de ce c'est bien, qui est une question esthétique aussi, hein.
This is a question for Elisabeth. Before you started discussing the three novels, you brought up the images of Chabrol's film Les Biches. And my question is, how does it function differently to read of the lesbian experience versus seeing images of lesbianism?
Yeah, it's a very good question. It's, of course, it's very interesting because when you see them, I mean, you suddenly confront yourself to something which is language, and then it falls back into the written language, I think. I wanted to bring up this film because I found a certain coincidence between the trio, which is played in L'Invité, and the trio which is actually played in Les Biches too. And of course it is an inverted ending where the girl actually kills the older woman in Les Biches, whether it's the contrary in L'Invité. But suddenly it's interesting to see, I mean, well, there is one relation that can be made, is delusion, deception, something like that, between the formulation of the images, which refers to other types of canonic images, and what you can make with reading a book, where you can make actually your images and manipulate them if you want, but then, voilà.
Thank you very much. The movie will start at 4. It's a documentary of Violette Leduc.
Yes.
Okay, thank you to